Ocho. Let's begin with a statement that is stupidly obvious, but it also has some pretty profoundly deep implications. The questions that you ask will shape the answers that you get.
What makes him think that?
Well, the party have had an opinion poll done. It seems all the voters are in favour of bringing back national service.
Well, have another opinion poll done showing the voters are against bringing back national service.
Well, we can't be for it and
Oh,
against.
of course they can, Bernard. Have you ever been surveyed?
Yes, well, not me, actually, my house. Oh, I see what you mean.
Well, Bernard, you know what happens. A nice young lady comes up to you. Obviously, you want to create a good impression. You don't want to look a fool, do you?
No.
No, so she starts asking you some questions. Mr. Woolley, are you worried about the number of young people without jobs?
Yes.
Are you worried about the rise in crime among teenagers?
Yes.
Do you think there's a lack of discipline in our comprehensive schools?
Yes.
Do you think young people welcome some authority and leadership in their lives?
Yes.
Do you think they respond to a challenge?
Yes.
Would you be in favor of reintroducing national service?
Yes. Oh, well, I suppose I might.
Yes or no?
Yes.
Of course you would, Bernard. After all you've told you can't say no to that. So, they don't mention the first 5 questions and they publish the last one.
Is that really what they do?
Well, not the reputable ones, no, but there aren't many of those. So, alternatively, the young lady can get the opposite result.
How?
Mr. Woolley, are you worried about the danger of war?
Yes.
Are you worried about the growth of armaments?
Yes.
Do you think there's a danger in giving young people guns and teaching them how to kill?
Yes.
Do you think it's wrong to force people to take up arms against their will?
Yes.
Would you oppose the reintroduction of national service?
Yes.
Now think about most of the forms that you've filled out that ask you about your racial identity. Race is often presented as a series of options or check boxes of which you're expected to select just one. However, it's important to consider how these questions are formulated. For instance, do we use the word white, or Caucasian, or European American? Do you group all of Asia together as Asian American? Or do you specify South Asian, East Asian, Indian subcontinental, Middle Eastern? Now, some people think that's all the same thing, but to others, like people who actually live there are major differences. We haven't even touched on biracial or multiracial individuals, or people with very complex kind of lineages, such as like a man who was born in the UK to African parents who then immigrated to the US but doesn't hold citizenship. What is he supposed to check? By forcing people to select a box, you're limiting the ways that they can respond to that question. What is your race? Now, you might think that the alternative is to just use an open-ended question, sort of fill in the blank. However, rather than solving the problem, you're only deferring it to the data analysis stage. Because then, as a researcher, you need to code all of these different responses. You know, if one person responds black and another person responds African American, are those the same things or do they mean something different? Now, this issue is sort of unavoidable. I mean, you have to ask questions in some way. But it's good for researchers to reflect on how they're asking these questions. And you need to recognize that the way that questions are asked, or other measures that are involved in doing research, they encourage certain kinds of responses, but they also discourage other kinds of responses. And that can affect the data that's being collected and the conclusions that we actually draw from it. So let's talk a little bit about the principles of questionnaire construction. Table 8.2 in your text gives a pretty good overview of principles that should guide the construction of questionnaires. I'm not going to go over everything in there. I just have a few things that I want to discuss. First of all, be clear in what you're asking. Have you ever come across a question that you've got no idea what's being asked of you? I do it all the time. Well, in 1995, the province of Quebec held a referendum on independence from Canada. Here's the question that was being asked of voters. Do you agree that Quebec should become sovereign after having made a formal offer to Canada for a new economic and political partnership within the scope of the bill respecting the future of Quebec and of the agreement signed on June 12, 1995? And so, a lot of people complained that the question was too long and too complicated. It was written for lawyers and policy analysts, not necessarily for the regular people, in both French and English. Fortunately, in my opinion, Les Québécois voted to remain part of Canada. But in contrast, we can look at Scotland. They also held a referendum vote on sovereignty just a little while ago. Here's the way that they worded their question. Should Scotland be an independent country? Well, there's not really much ambiguity about that. The issue being voted on is absolutely clear. Another thing that's important to be clear about is how you're defining your terms. For example, I could ask you, are you a heavy drinker? However, what's meant by heavy is not clear in that question. Obviously, heavy exists somewhere between never touching a drop and drinking till you black out every night. But the problem is, we all know people who drink less than us, and we all know people who drink more than us, unless we are the people who never touch a drop or black out every night. So relative to those extremes, we're always a moderate drinker, no matter how much we actually drink.
Chug-a-look, chug-a-look, make you wanna holler hidey-ho, burns your tummy, don't you know? Chug-a-look, chug-a-look.
We could also look at it from a cultural perspective. For example, drinking is far more a regular part of European life than it is in American life. What we might consider heavy drinking here might be considered moderate drinking there.
He drinks a whiskey drink, he drinks a vodka drink, he drinks a lager drink, he drinks a cider drink. He sings a song to remind him of the good times, he sings a song to remind him of the better times.
So it would be important when we're asking this question to define precisely what we mean by heavy drinking. So we could define it as 3 to 4 drinks for men or 2 to 3 drinks for women because they tend to have smaller bodies and process alcohol quicker on 4 or more nights per week. Now that we've got a clear definition, now it's much easier to answer yes or no, I am not a heavy drinker. Now another example is driving speed. Now I personally always drive the perfect speed, regardless of however many miles per hour over or under the limit I'm going. It's always perfect. But anyone who drives slower than I do is a terrible driver and should really just get off the road and walk. And anybody who's driving faster than me, obviously, is a totally reckless maniac who's going to get somebody killed. But my speed, always right. The thing is, every one of us is on the road thinking, pretty much exactly the same thing. And we can't all be right, can we? So, if we have a questionnaire and we're asking people whether they drive too fast, defining too fast is going to be important. For me, 12 miles over the limit might be too fast. For other people, the limit is the limit, and anything above that is too fast. Whatever it is, it just needs to be stated clearly. Finally, when we're talking about clarity, let's also talk a little bit about scales, because these can be kind of problematic. We're all familiar with like a Likert scale, on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 represents complete disagreement and 5 represents complete agreement, rate the following statement, etc., etc. Or similarly, you might have a pain rating scale, on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is absence and 10 equals unbearable pain. What do you feel right now? The problem is with these scales is we don't actually define what each number is supposed to represent. So how am I supposed to know what the difference between 7 and 8 is supposed to signify? Even if it's a 10, I always kind of wonder, couldn't it be more like a 9.5? Surely there could be somebody who's in worse pain than I am.
Beep, beep. Beep, beep.
Maybe that guy's pain makes my 10 look more like a 6, and I don't want to be kind of a wuss complaining about a 6. So clearly that creates a problem with the reliability of the scale. If one person's 10 is equal to another person's 6, and then the answers are kind of all over the place, then we're killing the reliability. So it's important when we do the assessment that our responses are clear, people know what they're answering, and that way we can conduct a rigorous and reliable survey. Just for the record, the questionnaire is the instrument, the survey is a method, so there's a difference between them, although people use those interchangeably a lot. So the next point is be efficient. Taking a questionnaire can actually be enjoyable, especially when the participant gets some kind of feedback or insight from it. And people love giving their input on things. They like to vote, they like to be heard, have their voice count. So the internet is littered with all kinds of polls and questionnaires and things. Most of them are total junk, but they're out there. In fact, if you look at it from a certain perspective, every click that you make online is a vote on content. It says to web developers that you value this over something else that you didn't click on. And so that gives us kind of some say in how the internet's developed. What kinds of things we'll see more or less of in the future, count the hits and things. But I'm also sure we've all had the experience of being asked to fill out a questionnaire that seems to be just never ending. If you've got a sort of questionnaire that's 500 items about your experience as a graduate student, chances are fatigue's going to set in around like the 80th, 100th question. And that can create bias because we become angry or we become annoyed or just tired. And we might just say, the hell with it, and fill in everything C. Or we might rush through things without reading, the questions properly. As a researcher, you'd want to avoid this situation because it's going to mess with your validity. You're not getting an accurate representation of your participants anymore. You're just getting their irritation. So the obvious solution then is to keep it brief. Of course, you want to have multiple items that address all the different aspects of whatever it is you're measuring. But keep in mind, when questions get repetitive, people get annoyed. So generally, stick with the minimum number of questions to get the data that you need. Next, watch out for potential bias in your questions. So for example, let's say I've developed a questionnaire at the end, sort of like a T-val, to evaluate sort of how I've done as a teacher in this class. One possible item might be on a scale of 1 to 7, where 1 represents never and 7 represents always. Rate the following statement. Paul presented the material in this class in an engaging manner. Well, the problem with this item is the words always and never. If we're really being honest, not everything that I've presented here has been very engaging. Some of it might actually have been boring. So being honest, you wouldn't say that I'm always engaging, but maybe most of the time you've enjoyed the videos and notes and things. And similarly, if you've absolutely hated these notes, in the videos that I've made, well, maybe sometimes you thought maybe a picture was kind of funny or, something popped out that was interesting to you. So it wouldn't entirely be never if you were being completely honest. Therefore, I'm not very likely to get a 7 or a 1. So the solution here is to soften the language. Instead of saying always, you say almost always. And that will provide a more accurate response rather than discouraging people from choosing, 2 out of the 7 responses. Another issue with survey research is response sets. That's something that they need to look out for. The video at the beginning of these notes showed how a line of questioning can create a kind of response set, where the previous questions produced a biased response to the main focus of the questionnaire, which was conscription or compulsory service. There are other times where people just say, yeah, I loved everything was great, and they'll just go 5, 5, 5, 5, 5 all the way down the questionnaire. And sometimes researchers attempt to discourage these kinds of response sets by doing a kind of reverse ordering or asking sort of negative questions. So statement number 1 was Paul was engaging in presenting the material. Statement number 2 might be Paul was very tedious in presenting the material. And if you answer 5 for both of those, then I know something's up. But generally, my advice is to kind of try to avoid these because they can be confusing for the people who are taking your survey, and they may be confusing to you doing the analysis afterwards as well. Obviously, you don't want your solution to create more problems. Now, one of the benefits of providing questionnaires is that they can be done anonymously, meaning that the identity of the respondent will be unknown to the researcher. And this privacy that you give to your participants should theoretically allow them greater freedom to answer honestly, without fear of judgment. Even so, there's still a tendency for respondents to skew their answers to be more socially acceptable. So, for example, I was taking a class in human sexuality a few years ago, and as part of the class I was reviewing surveys from different cultures around the world on sexual attitudes. And one phenomenon that I came across over and over again in all different parts of the world was that men seem to report far more numbers of partners than women do. So this begs the question, if women aren't having as much sex as men, then who are these men sleeping with?
I can't get no satisfaction. I can't get no satisfaction. 'Cause I tried, and I tried, and I tried, and I tried. I can't get no.
And this difference was so large that it wasn't easily accounted for by same-sex partnerships, which you would imagine would affect both genders about evenly. So I think the safe conclusion to arrive at is somebody's lying. In fact, due to cultural norms regarding, sexuality, men tended to over-report their sexual experiences, while women under-reported theirs. Now let's conclude with a note about qualitative questionnaires. Simply put, they don't exist. They are magic rainbow unicorns in space. And they're invisible. And they have psychic powers. And they can time travel.
Pink fluffy unicorns dancing on rainbows.
In spite of what the text says, a questionnaire is actually a terrible way of doing qualitative research. If you tell a qualitative researcher that you've done a qualitative survey, at the very least you're going to be greeted with some extreme eye rolling. And then they'll probably go and say some not very nice things behind your back. Qualitative research as a methodology involves much more than just asking a few open-ended questions. So what happens when people say they're doing qualitative surveys, or when they've included a few open-ended questions on a quantitative kind of questionnaire, is that responses are then coded into nominal variables and then they're counted. And if you're counting, this is clearly quantitative research. 35% of respondents reported that they had positive experiences with their academic advisors. Doing a frequency count of words or concepts in a response is not qualitative research. Qualitative research goes far more into depth. Now, if you want to have open-ended questions on your questionnaire, and that data is going to help you answer your research question, by all means go ahead and include them on a questionnaire. There's no issue with that per se. The issue is with calling it a qualitative study. But we're going to get into qualitative research a little bit later in the course, and hopefully this will all become clearer.
Pink fluffy unicorns dancing on rainbows.